going to move Joe down to the front. Let me just mention two things to you real quickly that you can pray for me specifically about. No? Okay, well, they've already picked them up. Thank you, John. This past week, for the first time, my white blood count cells were down a little. So I need you to pray for that because we don't want any interruption in the chemo. Tomorrow we'll get our fourth treatment. It starts tomorrow, and it goes for 2 days with a pump on me. Pray that goes well, because following this one, the fifth round that I'll get, which is every 2 weeks, if you remember, they're going to push it out a day or two, and they're going to take a CT scan of the lung to see about that little spot, a very small spot about the size of an eraser on the end of the pencil, and pray that number one, that it won't be malignant. Number two, if it is, that it's the same thing they cut out of my colon, which if it is, then the chemo that I'm taking in all probability will take care of it. So those are two things specifically that you can pray for me about, and I do appreciate it. In your bulletin, there was an outline of our lesson sheet for this week. It's going to be a continuation of last week, and we had some extra copies that we ran off, so some of you may have picked those up. If you didn't get one, are there any of just the bulletins left anywhere, or they all been given out? If we have any of those, if you don't have an outline, I'd like for each person, or at least each couple, be able to look on one. If you don't have one, raise a hand, and we got a couple of people. Okay. I don't know, were there any bulletins left out over here, Robert, on this side? There you go. Okay. Now, we'll go ahead. While they're trying to find those, you just keep putting your hand up. John Pugh's over here. He's a little slow, but he's very dependable. So you just raise your hand, and he'll get one to you, and there are several over on this side, and if he wants to give some of those out for somebody else to help. But last week we looked at 1 Corinthians 13 and in verse number 5, and if you remember, we talked about what 4 things: love is not rude, love is not self-seeking, love is not easily angered, and love does not keep a record of wrongs. Today we're going to look specifically at love is not easily angered. That's the time of the lesson, and there's a reason for that. And if you'll look, these first few comments I made, I've typed them out almost in their entirety there in the introduction, because I think they're so vital and so important. The reason we're going to look at anger specifically is because I believe anger perhaps may be the most misunderstood of all emotions. Maybe at least from a spiritual perspective. Because you see, anger is not always a sin. It can be, but it is not necessarily. And sometimes we think in terms of somebody becoming angry, and we think that shouldn't happen. But anger on occasions can be a very appropriate emotion. I want to just give you one brief example. I'm not even going to tell you everything about it, but when our oldest son was a senior in high school, about 4 weeks before graduation, he comes home and he tells me about something that happened with a teacher at the school, and I said, "You're kidding me?" He said, "No," and he said, "I started not to permit it, not to allow it." I said, "I wish you hadn't. I wish you'd have called me right then." But I called the principal, went over and met with the principal, my son, and the teacher, and we worked it out. It made me angry. Now, I tried to deal with it appropriately because I made it very clear it's not to happen again. My son needed me to do that. There are times that we need, anger may show evidence of love to individuals. There are times that God himself got angry. You see, anger is not the opposite of love. Apathy is. There's a difference. Sometimes it's very appropriate. Do you remember when Jesus went into the temple area? This was when the feast, some of the sacrifices were being offered, and those Israelites, many of them had traveled, some of them for more than a day, for maybe several days to get there. So they didn't bring the things they had to offer as a sacrifice, and those things were for sale. And he went into it, and he literally turned those tables over. And one of the recordings says that he took cords out of the temple and literally drove them out. And he said, "My house is to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." They were they were gouging the very people. They were having to come. They were having to get those things and make the sacrifices. And Jesus made it very clear. You don't do this. This is wrong. Anger can be a very appropriate emotion. It's how we deal with it. Now, there are two ways that we deal with it that I want to mention at the beginning that are probably not very appropriate to do. Number one is we clam up. And I was trying to think of some illustration. That's a pretty good one, isn't it? That turtle, what happens whenever he feels threatened or wants to be protected or maybe just get asleep and doesn't want you to bother him, he withdraws back in his shell. Now, to take anger and then put it inside and withdraw it and not ever deal with it is not a wise way to deal with anger. But then the other way that many times we respond to anger is we just kind of explode and let it all out. You remember Yosemite Sam? Isn't that what his name was? Wasn't he with Bugs Bunny a lot? I'm trying to remember back on the cartoons. And he would deal, and Bugs would get him so upset. He even got Bugs, I think, in a pot of boiling water. But Bugs always, he knew the guy that was writing the cartoon, and he always got out of it. But to blow up and to blow steam and to get rid of it, that's not the way to handle it either. So what we're going to look at is really just one point. How do we deal with anger and make it appropriate in the eyes of God? I want to mention 5 things to you. And if you want to turn and read with me in Proverbs. Now, we are going to put the scriptures up on the screen for you because I want everybody to be able to look at them. But line number 1 on your outline, we have to decide, and you can write this down, we have to decide to manage it. You see, one of the things we need to stop saying is, I can't help it. That's just the way I am. I got to let it get out. It'd be worse if I... No, you see, anger is a decision. We make a decision and we choose. It's a choice. You may want to write that down. We don't have to explode. We don't have to show our anger. We make a decision and we decide to do it. It's a choice. In Proverbs 29, in verse number 11, the writer said, "A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control," or a wise man stays cool. You see, it's not that we can't explode. We can. Well, we need to make a decision that we're going to manage it, and that it's not something that I just have to vent and let out. Secondly, we need to realize, and you can write this down on that line, that there's a cost to pay for our anger. Whenever we lose our temper, we always lose. There is a cost. Now, I want to read these 5 scriptures to you, and they will be up on your outline in Proverbs. We'll begin with Proverbs 11:29. Is that what it is? Yeah, 11:29. "He who brings trouble on his family will only inherit the wind." Another translation says that a fool provokes his family to anger and to resentment. We'll find after a while there's nothing worthwhile. We need to listen carefully to what the wise man is saying. Chapter 14, verse 17. "A quick-tempered man does foolish things, and a crafty man is hated." Verse 29. "A patient man has great understanding, but a quick-tempered man displays folly." And there are translations that says, displays his foolishness. Chapter 15, and in verse 18. "A hot-tempered man stirs up dissension, but a patient man calms a quarrel." And finally, in the 29th chapter, verse 22. An angry man stirs up dissension, and a hot-tempered one commits many sins. See, what we need to do is to realize that when we get angry, there will be a cost to pay. And it can be a sin. Now, I'm not talking about the anger that we should display. I'm talking about the kind of anger that we just let explode and we don't control. That's what he's talking about here. You see, there are at least 3 price tags that we pay for anger, and you see if I'm not right. Number 1, when we get angry and we explode, it creates more anger. And I think it creates more anger in 2 people, and there may be more than 2 involved. In the one that is exploding in the anger, the more we display our anger and let it go, sometimes the more angry we get. Am I right? But I can promise you, the people that we're venting our anger against when it's uncalled for, that they're getting angry. And they may even try to reason with us. But generally speaking, we don't want to be reasoned with in those occasions. And it may be that no matter what somebody says, even if every single thing they're saying is right and we're wrong in every single incident, we don't pay attention. And they realize after a while it just doesn't matter what I say. It's not going to change. That will produce apathy. A person will eventually say, it just doesn't matter. It's not going to change. And they just kind of forget it and they stay out of the way, which will eventually produce alienation. Can you think of anyone right now that you just avoid because you know there's no real discussion that's going to take place? Because no matter what I say, it'll be issue taken against. And you know, we've heard it said, and perhaps we've said it ourselves, never talk about 2 things, religion or politics. And on some occasions, that may even be an appropriate thing to remember. But there's some people you just avoid any discussion in certain areas, whether it's these 2 areas or some other, because you know it doesn't matter. You can't go there. See, we're talking about how to handle our anger, and we need to realize that there's a price to pay. We may win the argument, but it doesn't mean that we actually win. Thirdly, in controlling the anger, we need to think, and you can write this down, think before we speak. You heard the expression, we need to put our brain in gear before we put our mouth in motion. You may have heard it a little differently. I was trying to remember exactly how I'd heard it this week. Brain in gear before we put our mouth in motion. Is there anybody in here besides me that has put their foot in their mouth? Anybody? I see a few heads. The rest of you are just lying. No, I don't want to say that. You don't want to acknowledge it to your spouse sitting next to you. We all do. Let me tell you something I thought of this week for the first time. If we keep our mouth shut, we can't put our foot in it. That's pretty good, isn't it? That we might want to write that down. And I also, in trying to do a little research, found out this week that the average male or man speaks, on the average, 25,000 words every day. I thought, surely I don't say that many words. Then it said the average female. Now, wait a minute. I'm already hearing people snickering now. What? They only speak an average of 30,000 words a day. But that's 5,000 more than the male. See, so we need to understand as men that they've got more things they need to say, and we need to be able to listen. You know, I asked Robert Amonette, I said, Robert, does it bother you that Patsy gets the last word in? He said, not at all. I'm just glad if she ever gets to it. No, just kidding. Patsy, Robert didn't say that. I'll get Robert in big trouble, won't it? But there are times we really need to stop and think before we speak. In the 29th chapter of Proverbs, again, look there in verse number 11. He says, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. One translation says they stay cool, or they chill, or chill out. See, you didn't know that was a biblical statement, did you? Just chill. Just chill out. But sometimes that is exactly what we need to do. There are perhaps three things that we need to look at ourselves and try to understand. We need to ask the question. I'm talking about how to control anger. Why am I angry? Have you ever had a discussion with somebody and the thing just goes on and on and on and seems to no end, and finally both of you look and say, what did we start arguing about? Has that ever happened to anybody besides Carolyn and me? See, why am I angry? Secondly, what is it that I want or need that I'm not getting that's making me so frustrated that I get angry? And then thirdly, we need to ask ourselves the question, then how can I get that taken care of so that I can deal with the pent-up anger that is inside me? See, we don't need to be a Yosemite Sam. And it is something that we can control. Fourthly, we need to release it. Release. What are we going to release? We need to release our anger in the right way. And there is a right way to do it. Number one, listen, there's probably at least three don'ts, and you may think of some other don'ts, but number one is don't suppress it. Don't just pin it up like that turtle and put it and keep it all inside so that it becomes volatile one day and it comes out. Secondly, we don't need to pretend that it doesn't exist. Have you ever been talking to somebody and maybe you or maybe the other person, you say, somebody looks at you and says, you're angry. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. I am not. Yes, you are. I am not angry. Quit saying that. See? We don't need to pretend that the anger is not there. We need to deal with it. And the third thing we don't need to do is to be Yosemite Sam and just explode and just let it all out. But here's something we do need to do. We need to confess it to God. We need to acknowledge it. In Proverbs 15 and in verse number 1, now we're talking about how we release our anger. Here it is. And here's one verse that'll just tell you, how do you handle a volatile situation? A gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Is Solomon right? See, if you were to ask me, now remember, the lesson doesn't start here, it starts back here, which means it includes me. But if you ever go into a situation and if you were to ask me, John, I'm going to talk to somebody about it and I just know it's not going to be very pleasant, how would you recommend that I do it? And what I would recommend, and you're probably picking up on it right now, is to talk softly and slowly. It will diffuse. And isn't that what he said? A gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. It can diffuse the whole situation. Paul said in Ephesians 4 and in verse 26, he said, don't let your anger cause you to sin. Another translation says, what does it say? What's it? Okay, come on, help me out, Greg. Well, not let us. No, I mean the same sentence. Instead of saying, it says, be angry and sin not. Thank you. It's sometimes those King James passages forget me. That's what I grew up on and learned it, but it's the same principle. How do we manage it? Folks, we release it in the right way. We confess it to God, and then we release it. One scripture, and I was going to mention this earlier, but in Psalms 141, verses 1 through 3, listen to what David is saying. He said, O Lord, I call to you. Come quickly to me. Hear my voice when I call to you. May my prayer be said before you like incense. May the lifting up of my hands be like the evening sacrifice. Now he's praying to God, and here's his prayer, verse 3. Here's his comment. Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord, and keep watch over the door of my lips. Oh, how many times I wish I had prayed that prayer before I opened my mouth. We need to release it in the right way. Maybe every morning when we get up, we ought to just read those 3 verses. God, today, guard my mouth. Help me to watch my lips and the words that come out of it. Lord, help me. God, help me to be Jesus today as I talk to people. Oh, how many times I've prayed that in the last few years about how I respond and speak to my wife. I want to be Jesus to her. And so many times I let the words come out, and I should have prayed these 3 verses first. It's hard to take words back, isn't it? You can't gather them all back in. She has such a forgiving, precious heart. That helps. But that doesn't mean the sting isn't there. Finally, here's the bottom line. We need to allow God, and you can write this down, to transform our minds. You see, allow God to transform our minds. You see, anger is a learned behavior. It was modeled for you by someone. And if you learn it, in all probability, if you're not careful, you're modeling it right now for somebody else. We see it modeled on TV all the time. We see it out in the workplace. And all too often we see it in the home. And if parents model anger to their children, if the wife deals with her husband in front of her children in anger and hollering, and if the husband deals with his wife that way, and if we deal that way with our children, one day they will be parents. And guess what? They'll model it the way they have seen it modeled. And then what will happen to their children? They'll model it until somebody breaks the model. If anger is a learned behavior, it can also be unlearned. And both of those statements are true. And there are just 2 passages that I want to refer to. Proverbs 22. And it's verse 24 and verse 25. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered man. Now listen carefully to what the wise man is saying. Do not associate with one easily angered. Why? Or you may learn his ways and get yourself ensnared. I see, doesn't that just prove what we just said? If it's modeled for us, and if we're around it, and if we're, let me tell you, I want to say right now to some of you young people, young ladies especially, listen to me. If you know of some young man that is volatile, maybe you hear about the fact that he came out of the football field and went into the locker room and put his fist into it and dented it. Run. Run, run, run. You talk about God getting angry. I'll guarantee you every time God sees some burly-headed man beating on his wife or his children, he gets angry. And this man right here deals with it on a day-to-day basis. And I'll guarantee you there are times that John would like to take somebody out behind the woodshed and just beat the hound dog out of them. Of course, he can't do that. Paul probably says it the best in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And we are going to put this verse up on the screen. But if you have your Bibles, I wish you'd open it up and outline it and make a mark on it. Because anger is a learned behavior, and it can be unlearned, and this proves it. Paul said, therefore I urge you, brothers, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. You see? Well, then he says, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. Folks, our worship time isn't confined to this room. He said our lives are spiritual worship to God. So what do I need to do, Paul? Here it is. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We can be transformed. If not, we're saying that God can't do it. Probably the only way some of us would ever get past the anger part and what he is actually saying is to allow God himself to change it. On one occasion, Jesus, in talking to his disciples, he said, listen, it is difficult for a rich man to go to heaven. He said it not once but twice. And then his apostles said, then, Lord, who can receive your teaching? And then he said this, with man it is impossible. It is impossible for a wealthy person to go to heaven. But then he said, but with God, all things are possible. All things. And that's the way it is with our temper and our control. What we feel like is just part of our nature, and I got to do it, and I got to get out. No. God can change us if we will allow him to. And if we will pray Psalm 141, 1-3, and if we will ask him to transform our lives, God, please change me, so that when people look at me, they'll see you. If you will, just close your eyes. Our praise team is going to sing a song. You'll recognize it. Those of you that are older, you young people, may not recognize it. You close your eyes and please turn their mics on where they can be heard. Father, the words of this song, please help us. There are times, God, we know that we don't control ourselves very well, but I pray that you'll help all of us, beginning with me, Father, with every person in this audience, that we'll talk to you every day and ask you to help us to guard our mouths and our lips. Help us to realize that we can change our behavior. And when we can't, we know you can if we will allow ourselves to submit to you. I pray right now, and if you will, while they're singing this verse lastly, you ask God. You know the specific areas where you need for Father to change you. Just ask him.
Love one another, each other, blessed each other, children obey the Father's blessed command. Love one another, each other, blessed each other, children obey the blessed command.
I'm going to ask them to put back up on the screen the triangle that we put up last week, because I realize that in an audience this size, in all probability, Some of you are living in an environment where somebody is volatile and angry, and that may be the only way they deal with things. And it will be easier for you to implement the 5 things we mentioned today and to control your own anger. But we need to remember the left side of the triangle. We can't change others, and we could change that word change to the word control. We can't control their anger. Then we need to remember the left side, the right side of the triangle. But I can change. The only thing that you and I can do is to control how we respond. And then the bottom side of the triangle really is true. When we change and when we control ourselves. Folks, listen. If you finally let your pen and emotion get up to you and you respond in the way that you're being treated, and it may never change. But if we can allow God to control us when we don't want to be controlled, then eventually that situation can. Now I want to say a couple other things. You know that God hates divorce, and you know I would never encourage divorce. But if you're in a situation where somebody's physically abusing you, get out. And get out now. I didn't say divorce, but I said get out. God doesn't expect you to live in a situation that's like that. And that may be the only way you're able to handle it. Father, please, I pray if there's anyone in this audience today who is allowing themselves to become so angry that they're mistreating other people, and especially those that they claim to love, that they will cry out to you, beg their family to forgive them, and do whatever it takes to make the changes that are needed. It is in Jesus that I pray. Amen. We're going to close this morning with the same song that we sang last week that Taft led. It'll be on the screen. And when we finish singing the song, you will be dismissed. Thank you for coming. And let our lives this week be a spiritual worship to God. And may we cry out to the Father. Let us stand.
Love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God is love. Love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God is love. God is love. For God is love. God is love. God is love. God knows God. God is love. God is love. love, God is 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 love. Would you be seated, please? Before we begin here just a second, I do want to remind everyone Tuesday night of the prayer meeting we have here at the building. We're probably about to pray, and it's a very important part of our lives. Come and give yourself a chance to develop that and grow deeper in it at 7 o'clock this Tuesday evening.
Folks, we're gonna have a prayer. People are hurt. They've been hurt. And sometimes we need to change ourselves. And that's not always easy, is it? If we're the one that has hurt others, and probably most of us would fall into that category.